Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, spelled Brant, Hunt, Hunt, and today is Sunday. I believe it's the 18th day of August, 2024. Going to be reading a book, probably just the first chapter, that is, from a book by author Firstenberg, that's Firstenberg. A friend of mine named Jody suggested this book to me probably over a year ago or near a year ago. And so I started reading it. The name of the book is called Invisible Rainbow, Electricity and Life. This book is going to basically blow your socks off of you because most of us don't know what has happened in the last, well, 100 years, near that time frame, more than 100 years. This book was written in 2017. Um, so this is giving credit to this. It was originally published in 2017 by AGB, that's Adam George Bob Press, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and also in Bolivia. And this particular book, the paperback edition, was published by a company called Chessa, Chelsa, Green Publishing Company in 2020. So thank you for being here. So he states here something: for ease of reading, I have kept the endnotes to a minimum. However, all sources referred to in this text can be found in the bibliography at the back of the book, together with other principal works I have consulted. For the convenience of those interested in particular subjects, the literature in the bibliography is organized by chapter and within some chapters by topic instead of the usual single alphabetical listing. The name of the first chapter, we'll probably start with from the beginning and then do capture in a bottle and go from there. So usually they have a prologue, and I'm not probably going to read a prologue. Let's see, maybe we will read the prologue. Maybe that'll set the stage for those who are not aware of this. So let's just do that right now, since it gets to a little, kind of sets the background of what this book's all about. Once upon a time, the rainbow visible in the sky after a storm represented all the colors there were. Our Earth was designed that way. We have a blanket of air above us that absorbs the higher ultraviolets, that is, together with all of the X-rays and gamma rays from space. Most of the longer waves that we use today for radio communications were once absent as or rather they were there in infinitesimal amounts. So they were there infinitely. It's all over the place. So what he's talking about here, and I'm just going to give you a little short snippet here. He says that there were actually lower waves. Well, that's not lower waves, but longer waves. But longer waves are actually the shortest part of the frequency, the lower waves, I call them. But it's a long wave. When your first broadcast, it was linked back in the 1900s or thereafter. That was the first communication, I think, with radio, was from England or Europe with long wave band. There's a few stations still broadcasting from Europe that is long wave, but most of that has been almost eliminated in the last 15 to 20 years. And the reason why I know that simply is that I have always had an interest in shortwave and AM, medium wave, what they call, and also FM, but FM is not, it's a different wavelength, so to speak. Okay, or rather they were there. Okay, so they came to us from the sun and stars, but with energies that were a trillion times weaker than the light that also came from the heavens. So weak were the cosmic radio waves that they would have been invisible. And so life never developed organs that could see them. The even longer waves, the low frequency pulsation given off by lightning, are also invisible when lightning flashes. It momentarily fills the air with them, but they are almost gone in an instant. Their echo reverberates around the world. It's roughly 10 billion times weaker than the light from the sun. We never evolved organs to see this either. So what he's trying to give you is a picture here. If this was there in the originality of the planet, we would have organs. In other words, our eyes would be able to see this. But we never had this phenomenon until the last, basically, the last 150 years. But our bodies know that these colors are there. The energy of our cells, which is the radio frequency range, is infinitesimal. Every thought, every moment that we make surrounds us with low frequency pulsation whispers that were first detected in 1875 and are also necessary for life. The electricity that we use today, the substance that we send through wires and broadcast through the air without any thought, was identified around 1700 as a property of life. Only later did scientists learn to extract it and make it more inanimate objects, ignoring because they could not see its effects on the living world. It surrounds us today in all of its colors, its intensities that rivals the light from the sun, but we still cannot see it because it was not present at life's birth. We live today with a number of devastating diseases that do not belong here. I'll say that again, folks. We live today with a number of devastating diseases that do not belong here, whose origins we do not know, whose presence we take for granted and no longer question. What it feels like to be without them is a state of vitality that we have completely forgotten. Quote, anxiety disorder, end quote, afflicting 1/6 of humanity, did not exist before the 1860s, when telegraph wires first encircled the earth. No hint of it appears in the medical literature before 1866. Influenza, or we call the flu, in its present form was invented in 1889, along with alternating current. What's alternating current is simply AC. Okay, you have DC, which is called direct current, and alternating current is in 1889. It is with us always, like a familiar guest, so familiar that we have forgotten that it wasn't always so. So someone would have come here and came from, was able to live long enough. Well, some were probably had issues with it. You know, people who were born in the 1830s or 1850s who lived to be about 1900s or so began to encounter issues in their life. And we didn't know what was going on, so to speak. Doctors had to invent what we call names for these particular diseases. Many of the doctors who were flooded with the disease in 1889 have never seen a case before. So in other words, they didn't know this. No one knew this, okay? So prior to 1860s, diabetes was so rare that few doctors saw more than 1 or 2 cases during their lifetime. I'll say that again, folks. Prior to the 1860s, diabetes was so rare that few doctors saw more than 1 or 2 cases during their lifetime. It too has changed its character. Diabetes were once a skeletally thin. Obese people never developed the disease. So those who actually were enormously thin who actually developed diabetes, not the other way around at that first part. Heart disease at that time was the 25th most common illness behind accidental drowning. It was an illness of infants and old people. It was extraordinary for anyone else to have a diseased heart. Cancer was also exceedingly rare. Even tobacco smoking in non-electrical times did not cause lung cancer. Say that again, folks. Cancer was also exceedingly rare. Even tobacco smoking in non-electrified times did not cause lung cancer. So those who smoked cigarettes not cigarettes, but tobacco, I should say, because it wasn't really tobacco, cigarettes later on. Um, Indians smoked tobacco, it never harmed them. You ever wonder why? Never had cancer. These are the diseases of civilization that we have also inflicted on our animal and plant neighbors. Diseases that we live with because of a refusal to recognize the force that we have harnessed for what it is. The 60 cycle current in our house wiring, the ultrasonic frequencies in our computers, the radio waves in our televisions, the microwaves in our cell phone. These are only distortions of the invisible rainbow that runs through our veins and makes us alive. But we have forgotten. It is time that we remember. So that's the end of the prologue. Part 1. Chapter 1 simply says capture in a bottle. The experiment of Leyden, Leyden, was a craze that was immense, universal. Everywhere you went, people would ask you if you had experienced its effects. The year was 1746. The place, any city in England, France, Germany, Holland, Italy. A few years later, America, like a child prodigy making its debut, electricity had arrived and the whole Western world turned out to hear the performance. His midwives were Chris, Kleist, Curiaeus, Cunaeus, Alaman, Allamand, and Muschenbrock, spelled Muschenbrock, warned that they had helped give birth to a Ephaton terrible, whose shocks could take away your breath, boil your blood, and paralyze you. The public should have listened, been more cautious, but of course the colorful reports of those scientists only encouraged the crowds. Peter van Muschenbrock, professor of physics in the University of Leyden, has been using his usual friction machine. It was a glass globe that he spun rapidly on its axis while he rubbed it with his hands to produce the electrical fluid. In brackets, quote, what we know today as static electricity. Hanging from the ceiling by silk cords was an iron gun barrel, almost touching the globe. It was called the, quote, prime conductor, end quote, and was normally used to draw sparks of static electricity from the rotating glass sphere. It shows a sketch of that, how this was worked. But electricity in those early days was of limited use because it always had to be produced on the spot and there was no way to store it. So Muschenbrock, I should say, and his associates designed an ingenious experiment, an experiment that changed the world forever. They attached a wire to the other end of the prime conductor and inserted it in a small glass bottle, partly filled with water. They wanted to see if the electric fluid could be stored in a jar, and the attempt succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. Quote, I'm going to tell you about a new but terribly experiment, end quote. Muschenbrock wrote to a friend in Paris, quote, which I advise you never to try yourself, nor would I, who has experienced it and survived by the grace of God, do it again for all the kingdom of France, end quote. He held the bottle in his right hand, and with the other hand he tried to draw sparks from the gun barrel. Quote, suddenly my right hand was hit with such force that my whole body shook as though it's been struck by lightning. The glass, although thin, did not break, and my hand was not knocked away, but my arm and whole body were affected more terribly than I can express. In a word, I thought I was done for, end quote. His companion in invention, biologist Jean Nicholas Sebastian Ammann, when he tried the experiment, felt a, quote, prodigious blow, end quote. Quote, I was so stunned, end quote, he said, quote, that I could not breathe for some moments, end quote. The pain along his right arm was so intense that he feared permanent injury. Only half the message rests with the public, though. The fact that people could be temporarily, or as we will see, permanently injured or even killed by these experiments became lost in the general excitement that followed. Not only lost, but soon ridiculed and disbelieved and forgotten. Then, as now, it was not socially acceptable to say that electricity was dangerous. Just 2 decades later, Joseph Priestley, the English scientist who is famous for his discovery of oxygen, wrote his History and Present State of Electricity, in which he mocked the, quote, cowardly professor, end quote, Mushkenbach, and the, quote, exaggerated accounts, end quote, of the first experiments. Its inventors were not the only ones who tried to warn the public. Johann Heinrich Winkler, professor of Greek and Latin at Leipzig, Germany, tried the experiment as soon as he heard about it. Quote, I found great convulsions in my body, end quote. He wrote to a friend in London. Quote, it put my blood into great agitation, so that I was afraid of an ardent fever and was obliged to use refrigerating medicines. I felt a heaviness in my head as if I had a stone lying upon it. It gave me twice a bleeding at my nose, to which I am not inclined. My wife, who had only received the electrical flash twice, found herself so weak after it that she could hardly walk. A week after she received only once the electrical flash. A few minutes after she bled at the nose, end quote. From their experiments, Winkler took away the lesson that electricity was not to be inflicted upon the living, and so he converted his machine into a great beacon of warning. Quote, I read in the newspapers from Berlin, end quote, he wrote, quote, that they have tried these electrical flashes upon a bird and have made it suffer a great pain thereby. I did not repeat this experiment, for I think it was wrong to give such pain to living creatures, end quote. He therefore wrapped an iron chain around the bottle, leading to a piece of metal underneath the gun barrel. Quote, when then the electrification is made, end quote, he continued. Quote, the sparks that fly from the pipe upon the metal are so large and so strong that they can be seen, quote, even in the daytime and heard at the distance of 50 yards. They represent a beam of lightning of a clear and compact line of fire, and they give a sound that frightens the people that hear it, end quote. So when we're talking about, it's a phenomenon that takes place, which they had no idea what they were doing. They were playing with something, they didn't understand. And the problem simply is this experiment was began to cause havoc with those who quote unquote played with this. The general public did not react as he planned, however. After reading reports like Mushkenbach in the Proceeding of France's Royal Academy of Sciences and his own in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London, eager men and women by the thousands all over Europe lined up to give themselves the pleasure of electricity. It was probably best he'd ever said anything about it, you see, because what happened was the press made, as they always do, make hooboo about everything, so to speak. Abbot Antonio Nollet, Nollet, a theologian turned physicist, introduced the magic of the Leyden jar into France. He tried to satisfy the insatiable demand of the public by electrifying hundreds of people at once, having them take each other by the hands so as to form a human chain around in a large circle with the two ends close together. He would place himself at one of the ends while the person who represented the last link took hold of the bottle. Suddenly, the learned abbot, touching with his hand the metal wire, inserted it in the flax, would complete the circuit, and immediately the shock would be felt simultaneously by the whole line, I should say. So everybody was affected. Electricity had become a social affair. The world was possessed, as some observers called it, by electromagnetic, end quote. The fact that Nolan had electrocuted several fish and sparrow with the same equipment did not deter the crowds in the least. This is what people like. They like to see a show. That's why they go, to, see these, whatever they do. A lot of times people do these crazy things. Like, for example, uh, Evel Knievel, he jumped I guess he jumped a particular canyon at one time, but people would flash there to come see a show. I've already talked about this with another person about the railroads at one time that I read in history, that the railroads were trying to seek quote unquote pastors for their trains. And this was done one time in Ohio, and didn't happen because the weather was bad, so it didn't take place. But the one in Texas did take place, and what happened was they chose to run two steam-operated locomotives at each other. And there were literally thousands of people there, folks. They paid, I don't know, $4 or whatever it was, $2, whatever, such and such. They had even concession stands, so to speak. They were selling, drinks or whatever, water, whatever, you name it, and also food. And it had what I call a place where people could view this, to see the great collision of two locomotives running at each other. Both the quote unquote engineers of those trains jumped off of those locomotives as they ran against each other. It did cause it did cause harm to people, folks. They knew that. Even the people knew this. In fact, I think there was a few people got killed, and some got maimed by this. Unfortunately, they were the ones that were closest to it. The fact that Nolan had executed several fish and a sparrow with the same equipment did not deter the crowds at least. Okay, at Versailles, in the presence of the king, he electrified a company of 240 soldiers of the French Guard holding each other by the hands. He electrocuted a community of monks at the Carthusian monastery in Paris, stretched out in a circle more than a mile around, each connected to his neighbor by iron wires. The experiment became so popular that the public began to complain of not being able to give themselves the pleasure of electric shock without having to wait in line or consult a physician. A demand was created for a portable apparatus that everyone could purchase for a reasonable price and enjoy at their leisure. And so the quote Ingelhouse bottle, end quote, was invented. Enclosed in an elegant looking case, it was a small Leyden jar joined to a varnished silk ribbon and a rabbit skin with which to rub the varnish and charge the jar. Electric canes were sold, C-A-N-E-S is what it is. Quote, price for all pocketbooks, end quote. These were Leyden jars cleverly disguised as walking canes, which you could charge, you could charge separately and trick unsuspecting friends and acquaintances into touching. In other words, it became a joke. It's a way of, what we used to do, we rub our hands, such and such, or do our shoes, we touch someone with static electricity when we was young kids. That's kind of the thrill of it, you see. Then there was the, quote, the electric kiss, end quote, a form of recreation that even preceded the invention of the Leyden jar, but became much more exciting afterwards. Physiologist Albert von Haller at the University of Göttingen declared incredulously that such parlor games had, quote, taken the place of quadrille, end quote. Quote, could one believe, end quote, he wrote, quote, that a lady figure, that her whalebone petticoat could send forth flashes of true lightning, and that such charming lips could set on fire a house, end quote. So this was reproduced. They did a photo of this. I think it's a photo. I guess it has to be, or a drawing of this machine. The woman is standing on a type of pedestal about, this that I have, and she's getting ready to kiss a man, and this other guy's got an electrical thing running with his hand, so to speak. In other words, people are so bored with life, so they choose to do this. This is actually in the Dutchess Museum in 1982. Quote, she was a, quote, angel, end quote, wrote German physicist George Matthias Bose, with, quote, white swan neck, end quote, and quote, blood-crowned breasts, end quote, who, quote, steals your heart with a single glance, end quote, but whom you approach at your peril. He called her Venus Electrifical, end quote, in a poem published in Latin, French, and German that became famous throughout Europe. Quote, this is the poem here. If a mortal only touches her hand, or such a godchild even only her dress, the sparks burn the same through all of one limbs. As painful as it is, he seeks it again. Even Benjamin Franklin felt compelled to give instructions, quote, let A and B stand on wax, or A on wax and B on the floor. Give one of them a electrolyzed file in hand, let the other take hold of the wire. There will be a small spark, but when their lips approach, they will be struck and shocked, end quote. Wealthy ladies hosted such an entertainment in their homes. They hired instrument makers to craft large or make electrical machines that they displayed like pianos. People of more moderate means brought off the shell models that were available as assortments of sizes, styles, and prices. Aside from entertainment, electricity, assumed to be related to or identified with a life force, was used primarily for its medical effects. Both electrical machines and Layton jars found their way into hospitals, oh my, and into the offices of doctors wanting to keep up with the times. An even greater number of electricians who were not medically trained set up office and began treating patients. One reads of medical electricity. Hold on a second here, I'm going to do something. One reads of a medical electricity being used during the 1740s and 1750s by the practitioners in Paris, Montpellier, Geneva, Venice, Turin, Bologna, Leipzig, London, Dorchester, Edinburgh, Shrewsbury, Worcester, Newcastle upon Tyne, Uppsala, Stockholm, Riga, Vienna, Bohemia, and The Hague, which is in Holland, I think is that where it's at. The famous French revolutionary and Dr. Jean-Paul Marais, also a practitioner of electricity, wrote a book about it titled Memoirs sur l'électricité médicale. In other words, memoirs of medical electricity. Franklin, treating patients with electricity in Philadelphia, stated them that static electricity later became known in the 19th century as Franklinization, meaning naming it after Franklinization, end quote. Even John Wesley, the famous founder of the Methodist Church, published a 72-page tract in 1759 under the title Desiderium, or Electricity Made Plain and Useful. He called electricity, quote, the noblest medicine yet known in the world, end quote, to be used in diseases of the nervous system, skin, blood, and respiratory system, and kidneys. Quote, a person standing on the ground, end quote, he felt obliged to add, quote, cannot easily kiss an electrified person standing on the Roslyn, end quote. Wesley himself electrified thousands of people at the headquarters of the Methodist movement and at other locations around London. My, oh my. And it wasn't just prominent individuals who were setting up shop. So many non-medical people were buying and renting machines for medical use that London's physician James Graham wrote in 1779, quote, I tremble with the apprehension for my fellow creatures when I see in almost every street in this great metropolis a barber, a surgeon, a tooth drawer, a apothecary, or a common mechanic turning electrical operator. Since electricity could initiate contractions of the uterus, it became a tactical, understood method of attaining abortions. Francis Lawson, for example, was a London electrician with an extensive practice who advertised that he treated poor women gratis for Amelia Maria, end quote. Even farmers began testing electricity on their crops and proposing it as a means of improving agricultural production, as we will see in chapter 6. The use of electricity on living beings in the 18th century was so widespread in Europe and America that a wealth of valuable knowledge was collected about its effects on people, plants, and animals, knowledge that had been entirely forgotten, that is far more extensive and detailed from what today's doctors are aware of, who see daily but without recognition its effects on their patients, and who do not even know such knowledge ever existed. This information is both formal and informal. Letters from the individual describing their experiences, that is, accounts written up in newspapers and magazines, medical books and treatises, papers read at meetings of scientific societies, and articles published in newly found scientific journals. As early as the 1740s, 10% of all articles published in the Philosophical Transactions were related to electricity. And during the last decade of that century, fully 70% of all articles on electricity in the prestigious Latin journal called Commentaria de Revis in Scientiae Naturale et Medical Geste. That's butchered Latin, sorry folks. This is a medical journal. Had to do with its medical uses and its effect on animals and people. So again, they're using this. And in reality, simply, are they really know what's going on? What are the long-term reactions to this? Seriously, you're playing with something you really don't know. And people are just want to be the talk of the town. You know, hey, well, look at my place. Come over here. We're going to play with electricity tonight. Such and such. We're going to kiss a woman, such and such, and get electrified with her lips. But the floodgates were wide open now, and the torrent of enthusiasm about electricity rushed on unhindered and would continue to do so during the coming centuries, sweeping caution against the rocks, crushing hints of danger like so many bits of driftwood, obliterating whole tracts of knowledge and reducing them to mere footnotes in the history of invention. So that's chapter 1. So I'm going to look at something here real quick. 32 minutes here. Yes. Hello there. Good to see you. Good day. So we're going to, this is about 30 minutes long. We're going to see what chapter 2 has here. Just bear with me. Chapter 2 is simply, let's see, we're going to go with this chapter here. Bear with me as I scroll up and down here with the chapter. The second chapter is called The Deaf to Hear and the Lame to Walk. A Burmese elephant has the same set of genes whether it toils in a logging camp or runs free in the forest. But its DNA will not tell you the details of its life. In the same way, electrons cannot tell us what is most interesting about electricity. Like elephants, electricity has been forced to bear our burdens and more great loads, and we have worked out more or less precisely its behaviors while in captivity. But we must not be fooled into believing we know everything important about the lives of its wild cousins. What is the sum or source of the thunder and lightning that causes clouds to become electrified and discharge their fury upon the earth? Science still does not know. Why does the earth have a magnetic field? What makes comb hair frizzy, nylon cling, and party balloons stick to walls? This most common of all electrical phenomena is still not well understood. How does our brain work? Our nerves function? Our cells communicate? How is our body growth choreographed? We are still fundamentally ignorant. And the question raised in this book, quote, what is the effect of electricity on life, is one that modern science doesn't even ask. Science only concern today is to keep human exposure, quote, below a level that will cook your cells. The effect of non-legal electricity is something mainstream science no longer wants to know. But in the 18th century, scientists not only asked the question, but began to supply answers. Early friction machines were capable of being charged to about 10,000 volts, enough to deliver a stinging shock, but not enough then or now to be thought dangerous. By way of comparison, a person can accumulate 30,000 volts on their body in walking across a synthetic carpet. Discharging it stings but won't kill you. At one point, at one pint that is latent jar could deliver a more powerful shock containing about 0.1 joules of energy, but still about 100 times less than what is thought to be hazardous, and thousands of times less than shocks that are routinely delivered by defibrillators to deprive people who are in cardiac arrest. Defibrillators, According to mainstream science today, the spark, shocks, and tiny currents used in the 18th century should have had no effects on health, but they did. Imagine you are a patient in 1750 suffering from arthritis. Your electrician would seat you in a chair that had glass legs so that it was well insulated from the ground. This was done so that when you were connected to the friction machine, you would accumulate the, quote, electric fluid, end quote, in your body instead of draining it into the earth. Oh my goodness, playing with fire. That's my statement, playing with fire. Depending on the philosophy of your electrician, the severity of your disease, and your own tolerance for electricity, there are a number of ways to, quote, electrolyze, end quote, you. In the electric bath, end quote, which was the most gentle, you would simply hold in your hand a rod connected to the prime conductor, and the machine would be cranked continuously for minutes or hours, communicating its charge throughout your body and creating electrical, quote, aura around you. If this was done gently enough, you would feel nothing. Just as a person who shudders their feet on a carpet can accumulate a charge on their body without being aware of it. After you were thus, quote, bathed, end quote, the machine would be stopped and you might be treated with the, quote, the electric wind, end quote. Electricity discharges most easily from pointed conductors. Therefore, a grounded pointed metal or wooden wand would be brought towards your painful knee, and you would again feel very little, perhaps the sensation of a small breeze at the charge that had built up in your body slowly dissipated through your knee into the grounded wand. For a stronger effect, your electrician might use a wand with a rounded end instead of a continuous current draw, actually sparks from your ailing knee. And if your condition were severe, say your leg was paralyzed, you could charge up a small latent jar and give your leg a series of strong shocks. Electricity was available in two flavors, that is positive or vitreous, that is electricity obtained by rubbing glass, and negative, that is, or resonance, which is called resonance electricity, end quote. Originally obtained by rubbing sulfur or various resins, your electrician would most likely treat you with positive electricity as if it was the variety normally found on the surface of the body in a state of health. So what I'm trying to talk to you about here, folks, we've got people already who know very little or something about electricity, but they don't really know a whole lot. And we got people out here, what I call amateurs, that are doing this. In other words, there is no training in this, so to speak. Maybe they did some training with someone, saw something, said, let me try this. I want to go in business and sell this. I want to supposedly help people, whatever. But did they ever try it on themselves? Or did they ever go to ask someone, maybe at a college, that is, or, and ask about this also to basically find out more about it? And, is it worthy? Although it seems as though they were all go-to here. But it seems as though people are enamored by this spark. The spark of what you call electrotherapy was stimulated health by restoring the electrical equivalent of the body where it was out of balance. The idea was certainly not new. In another part of the world, the use of natural, natural, electricity had been developed to a fine art over thousands of years. That was called acupuncture needles, as we will see in Chapter 9, conducted atmospheric electricity into the body, where it travels along precise mapped pathways, returning to the atmosphere through other needles that complete the circuit. So you see the Eastern world knew something of this, but not the Western world. By comparison, electrotherapy in Europe and America, although similar in concept, was an infinite science, you see, using instruments that were like sledgehammers. European medicine in the 18th century was full of sledgehammers. If you went to a conventional doctor for your rheumatoid issue, you might expect to be bled, purged, vomited, blistered, and even dosed with mercury. Most mercury is an enormous poison. Yet they were playing with this stuff back then. And they still are. All your teeth that are with fillings have mercury in them. Are you aware of that? It's easy to understand that going to electrician instead might seem a very attractive alternate, and it remained attractive until the beginning of the 20th century. After more than half a century of unceasing popularity, electrotherapy fell temporarily out of favor during the early 1800s in reaction to certain cults, one of which had grown up in Europe around a gentleman named Anthony Mesmer and his so-called magnetic, end quote, healing, and another in America around Elisha, Elisha Perkins, and his electric, quote, tractors, 3 inches long metallic pencils with which one made passes over a diseased part of the body. Neither man used actual magnets or electricity at all, but they gave those methods for a while a bad name. By mid-century, electricity was again mainstream, and in the 1880s, 10,000 American physicians were administering it to their patients. Electrotherapy finally fell permanently out of favor in the early 20th centuries, perhaps one suspects because it was incompatible with what was then going on in the world. You see, electricity was no longer a subtle force that had anything to do with living things. It was a dynamo capable of propelling locomotives, executing prisoners, and not curing patients. But sparks delivered by a friction machine a century and a half before the world was wired carried quite different associations. There's no doubt that electricity sometimes did cure diseases, both major and minor. Reports of success over almost 2 centuries were sometimes exaggerated, but they are too numerous and often too detailed and well attested to dismiss them all. Even in the early 1800s, when electricity was not in good repute, reports continued to emerge that cannot be ignored. For example, the London Electrical Dispensary between September 29, 1793 and June 4, 1819, admitted 8,685 patients for electrical treatment. So roughly here, these 3,962 were listed as cured. So we're looking less than 50% here, folks. Probably about 40%. Let's see if I'm right there. Let's see, 4,000. Yeah, it's probably about 45 to 40% as cured. And another 3,308 as relieved when they were discharged. So in other words, they, this is kind of a fine line here. They're saying that, they've gotten over 84% success rate. But what do they mean by relieve? That's what I'm trying to say. In other words, the pain doesn't come back, or does it come back and it has to be done again? That would be under cure. You see, cure is in ED, which means past tense. So they would even say when it, quote unquote, relieved the pain, but it didn't actually, quote unquote, cure the pain. You see, it's like going and taking something for a day or aspirin. Your headache is, you're having a headache, it goes away, but it doesn't go away always, and then you have another one. You haven't been cured, folks. You just have another headache. You've just been relieved of that moment by a pill. You see, what's causing a headache? What's causing the anxiety because of the headache? You see, what's the bottom line here? Although the main focus of this chapter will be on effects that are not necessarily beneficial, it is important to remember why 18th century society was enthralled with electricity, just as we are today. For almost 300 years, the tendency has been to chase its benefits and dismiss its harms. But in the 1700s and 1800s, the daily use of electricity in medicine was a constant reminder, at least, that electricity was intimately connected with biology. Here in the West, electricity as a biological science remains in its infancy today, and even its cures have been long forgotten. I will recall just one of them. Quote, this is a section called Making the Deaf Hear. In 1851, the great neurologist Benjamin Duchesne de Broglie achieved renown for something for which he is least remembered today. A well-known figure in the history of medicine, he was certainly no quack. He introduced modern methods of physical examinations that are still in use. He was the first physician ever to take a biopsy from a living person for the purpose of diagnosis. He published the first accurate clinical description of polio. A number of diseases that he identified are named for him, most notably the muscular dystrophy. He is remembered for all of those things, but in his own time, he was the somewhat unwilling center of attention for his work with the deaf. He knew the anatomy of the ear in great detail. In fact, it was for the purpose of elucidating the function of the nerve called the chorda, tympanic, tympani, which passes through the middle ear, that he asked a few deaf people to volunteer to be the subject of electrical experiments. The incidental and unexpected improvements in their hearing caused him to be inundated with requests from within the deaf community to come to Paris for treatments. And so he began to minister to a large number of people with nerve deafness, using the same apparatus that he had designed for his research, which fit snugly into the ear canal and contained a simulating electrode. His procedure to a modern reader might seem unlikely to have had any effect at all. He exposed his patient to pulses of the feeblest possible current, spaced half a second apart for 5 seconds at a time. Then he gradually increased the current strength, but never to a painful level and never far more than 5 seconds at a time. And yet by this means he restored good hearing in a matter of days or weeks to a 26-year-old man who had been deaf since age 10, a 21-year-old man who had been deaf since he had measles at age 9, a young woman recently made deaf by an overdose of quinine given for malaria, and numerous others with partial or complete hearing loss. 50 years earlier in Gero, Germany, a apothecary, that is, dealing with herbs, named Johann Spengler became famous throughout Europe for a similar reason. Though he was denounced by the director of the Institute for the Deaf and Dumb in Berlin, he was besieged by the deaf themselves with requests for treatment. His results were attested in court documents, and his methods were adopted by contemporary physicians. He himself was reported to have fully or partially restored hearing to no less than 40 deaf or hard of hearing individuals, including some deaf from birth. His methods, like Duchesne, were disarmingly simple and gentle. He made the current weaker or stronger according to the sensitivity of his patient, and each treatment consisted of brief pulses of electricity spaced 1 second apart for a total of 4 minutes per ear. The electrode was placed on the flap of the cartridge in front of the ear for 1 minute, inside the ear canal for 2 minutes, and on the mastoid process behind the ear for 1 minute. So that's the total minute. So he moved it around the ear. And after 50 years before Spengler, Swedish physician Johann Lindholt, writing from Stockholm, reported the full or partial restoration of hearing during a 2-month period to a 57-year-old man who had been deaf for 32 years, a youth of 22 whose hearing loss was recent, a 7-year-old girl born deaf, a youth of 29, hard of hearing since age 11, and a man with hearing loss and tinnitus of the left ear. All patients, end quote, wrote Lindholt, quote, were treated with gentle electricity, either the simple current or the electric wind, end quote. Lindholt in 1752 was using a friction machine. Half a century later, Spengler used galvanic currents from an electric pile, forerunner of today's batteries. Half a century after that, Duchesne used alternate current from an induction coil. British surgeon Michael Labimbe simply successfully used a friction machine in 1810s, and the Gabang currents later on. What they all had in common was their insistence on keeping their treatments brief, simple, and painless. So they were not what I call very strong pain, they were looking for things simply very gentle on these, especially with the ears. Okay. Seeing and tasting electricity, aside from attempting to cure deafness, blindness, and other diseases, early electricians were intentionally interested in whether electricity could be directly perceived by the five senses. Another question about which modern engineers have no interest and modern doctors have no knowledge, but whose answer is relevant to every modern person who suffers from electrical sensitivity, though. When he was still in his early 20s, the future explorer Alexander von Humboldt lent his own body to the elucidation of this mystery. It would be several years before he left Europe on the long voyage that was to propel him far up the Orinoco River and to the top of Mount Chimborazo. That is, collecting plants as he went making systematic observations of the stars and the earth and the cultures of Amazonian people. Half a century would pass before he would begin work on his 5-volume Cosmos, an attempt to unify all existing scientific knowledge. But as a young man supervising mining operations in the Bayeux district of Bavaria, the central question of his day occupied his spare time. In electricity really the life force? People were asking this question, gnawing gently at the soul of Europe since the days of Isaac Newton, and suddenly became insistent, forcing itself out of the lofty realms of philosophy and into the dinner time discussion around the table of ordinary people, whose children would have to live with the chosen answer. The electric battery, which produced a current from the contact of dissimilar metals, had just been invented in Italy. Its implications were huge. Friction machines, bulky and expensive, unreliable, subject to atmospheric conditions, might no longer be necessary. Telegraph systems, already designed by a few visionaries, might now be practical, and questions about the nature of electric fluid might come closer to being answered. In the early 1790s, Humboldt threw himself into the research with enthusiasm. He wished, among other things, to determine whether he could perceive this new form of electricity with his own eyes, ears, nose, and taste buds. Others were doing similar experiments. In Italy, there was Alessandro Pode, George Hunter, and Richard Fowler. In England, Christopher Plack. In Germany, Peter Abgar. In Denmark, but none more thoroughly digitally than Humboldt. Consider that today we are accustomed to handling 9-volt batteries with our hands without a thought. It's considered that millions of us are walking around with silver and zinc, as well as gold, copper, and other metals in the fillings in our mouths. Then consider the following experiment of Humboldt's using a single piece of zinc and one of silver that produced an electrical tension of about a volt. Quote, a large hunting dog, naturally lazy, very patient, let a piece of zinc be applied against his palate and remained perfectly tranquil while another piece of zinc was placed into contact with the first piece with his tongue. But scarcely one touched his tongue with the silver. Then he showed his aversion in a humorous manner. He contracted his upper lip convulsively and licked himself for a very long time. It sufficed afterwards to show him the piece of zinc to remind him of the impression he had experienced and to make him, quote, angry, end quote. The ease with which electricity can be perceived and the variety of the sensations would be a revelation to most doctors today. When Humboldt touched the top of his own tongue with the piece of zinc and its point with the piece of silver, the taste was strong and bitter. When he moved the piece of silver underneath his tongue, it burned. Moving the zinc further back and the silver forward made his tongue feel cold, and when the zinc was moved even further back, he became nauseated and sometimes vomited, which never happened if the two metals were the same. The sensations always occur as soon as the zinc and silver pieces were placed in metallic contact with each other. A sensation of sight was just as easily elucidated by 4 different methods using the same 1-volt battery by applying the silver armature of one moistened eyelid, that is your eyelid, and the zinc on the other, or one in the nostril and the other on the eye, or one on the tongue and one on the eye, and even one to the tongue and one against the upper gums. In each case, at the moment the two metals touched each other, Humber saw a flash of light. If he repeated the experiments too many times, his eyes became inflamed. In Italy, Voitot, the inventor of the electric barrier, succeeded in eliciting sensation of sound not with one pair of metals, but with 30 attached to electrodes into each ear. With the metals he originally used in his, quote, pile, P-I-L-E, end quote, using water as electrolyte. This may have been about a 20-volt barrier. This is why the name volts. You can see these names, V-O-L-T-A, volted. So you can see that we now call it volts. That's why we have that name. It being 20-volt barrier, 1 volt, whatever. Volter heard only a cracking sound, which could have been a mechanical effect on the bones of his middle ears, and he did not repeat the experiment, fearing that the shock to his brain might be dangerous. It remained for German physician Rudolf Brenner, B-R-E-N-N-E-R, 7 years later, using more refined equipment and smaller currents to demonstrate actual effects on the auditory nerve, as he will see in chapter 15. And the next section is called Speeding Up the Heart and Slowing It Down. Back in Germany, Humboldt, armed with the same single piece of zinc and silver, turned his attention next to the heart. Together with his older brother, Wilhelm, and supervised by a well-known physiologist, Humboldt removed the heart of a fox and prepared one of his nerve fibers so that the armatures could be applied to it without touching the heart itself. Quote, at each contact with the metal, the pulsations of the heart was clearly changed. Their speed, but especially their force and the elevation were augmented, end quote, he recorded. The brothers next experimented on frogs, lizards, and toads. If the diastatic heart beats 21 times in a minute after being galvanized, it beats 38 to 42 times in a minute. If the heart has stopped beating for 5 minutes, it restarted immediately upon contact with the two metals. Together with a friend in Leipzig, Humboldt stimulated the heart of a carp that had almost stopped beating, pulsing only once every 4 minutes. After massaging, the heart proved to have no effect. Galvanization was restored, the rate to 35 beats per minute. The two friends kept the heart beating for almost a quarter of an hour by repeated stimulation with a single pair of dissimilar metals. On another occasion, Humboldt even managed to revive a dying, whatever this is called, linnet, L-I-N-N-E-T, that was lying feet up, eyes closed on his back, unresponsive to the prick of a pin. Quote, I hastened to place a small plate of zinc in its beak and a small piece of silver in its rectum, end quote, he wrote. And I, quote, I immediately established a communication between the two metals with an iron rod. What was my astonishment when at the moment of contact, the bird opened its eyes, raised itself on its feet, and beat its wings. It breathed again for 6 or 8 minutes and then calmly died, end quote. Nobody proved that a 1-volt battery could restart a human heart, but scores of observers before Humboldt and reported that electricity increased the human pulse rate, knowledge that is not possessed by doctors today. Okay, you hear that? So this has not been shared with people, see. So your modern day doctors don't even know this has been dealt with, is what I'm gathering from what this is saying. German physician Christian Gottlieb Kronstein and Karl Abraham Gerhardt, German physician Celine Steigerherr, Swiss physician J. John Jockenberg, French physician Francois Blaise de Sauvé de la Croix, and Pierre Montet de Lave Venet, and Jean, or what we call it, Baptiste Bonifaz, French physician Joseph Signal de la Font, and Italian physician Eusebio Sagrario and Giovanni Berranti were just a few of the observers who reported that the electric bath increased the pulse rate by anywhere from 5 to 30 beats per minute when positive electricity was used. Negative electricity had the opposite effect. In 1785, Dutch pharmacist Willem van Vel conducted 169 trials on 43 of his patients, men, women, and children, aged 9 to 60, finding an average of 5% increase in the pulse rate when the person was bathed with positive electricity, and a 3% decrease in the pulse rate when the person was bathed with negative electricity. When positive sparks were drawn, the pulse increased by 20%. But there were only averages, you see. No two individuals reacted the same to electricity. One person's pulse always increased from 60 to 90 beats per minute. Another always double. Another pulse became much slower. Another reacted not at all. Some of Van Valkenburg's subjects reacted in a manner opposite to the majority. A negative charge always accelerated their pulse, while a positive charge slowed it down. Observations of these kinds came quickly and abundantly, so that by the end of the 18th century, a basic body of knowledge had been built up about the effects of electric fluid, usually the positive variety, you see, on the human body. It increased both the pulse rate, as we have seen, and the strength of the pulse. It augmented all of the secretions of the body. Electricity caused salivation and made tears to flow. You see this, you can see you're getting right in what we call manipulation of things here, folks. This is what something is kind of scary, okay? Okay, electricity caused salivation and made tears to flow and sweat to run. It caused the secretion of earwax and nasal mucus. It made gastric juice flow, stimulating the appetite. It made milk to be let down and menstrual blood to issue. It made people urinate copiously and move their bowels. You see, you're playing with stuff you shouldn't be playing, somewhat here already. But this is what they did. They wanted to find people willing to do this, a lot of times for free. Some maybe got paid, who knows. Most of these actions were useful in electrotherapy and would continue to be so until the early 20th century. Other effects were purely unwanted. You see, electrification almost always caused dizziness and sometimes a sort of mental confusion, instupidimento, end quote, as the Italians called it. It also commonly produced headaches, nauseated, weakness, fatigue, and heart palpitations. Sometimes it caused shortness of breath, coughing, or asthmatic-like wheezing. It often caused muscle and joint pains and sometimes mental depression. Although electricity usually caused the bowels to move, often with diarrhea, repeated electrocution could result in constipation, though, you see. Electricity caused both drowsiness and insomnia. Humbug, in experiments on himself, found that electricity increased blood flow from wounds and caused serum to flow copious out of blisters. Gerhardt divided 1 pound of freshly drawn blood into 2 equal parts, placed them next to each other, and electrified one of them. The electrified blood took longer to clot. Antonio Pade, a pharmacist, that is, at the Hôtel d'Ailleux, the famous hospital in Paris, agreed and said that electricity is contraindicated in cases of hemorrhages. Consistent with this are numerous reports of nosebleeds from electrification. Winkler and his wife, as already mentioned, got nosebleeds from the shock of Leyden's jar. In the 1790s, Scottish physician and entomologist Alexander Monro, who is remembered for discovering the function of the lymphatic system, got nosebleeds from just a 1-volt Verdi whenever he tried to alleviate the sensation of light in his eye. Dr. Monro was so excitable by galvanism that he bled from the nose when having the zinc very gently inserted in his nasal faucet. He put it in contact with an armature applied to his tongue. The hemorrhaging always took place at the moment when the lights appeared. This is reported by Humbug. In his early 1800s, Conrad Quinzel in Stockholm reported that galvanism, quote, frequently caused nosebleeds. Continue. Avec Nollet proved that at least one of these effects, that is perspiration, occurred merely from being in an electric field. So now they're playing with what we call a wire type of cage, so to speak. Actual contact with the friction machine wasn't even necessary now. He electrified cats, pigeons, several kinds of songbirds, and finally human beings. In careful, controlled, repeatable experiments accompanied by modern-looking data tables, he had demonstrated measurably weight loss in all of his electrified subjects. Due to an increase in evaporation from their skin, I should say, he had even electrified 500 houseflies in a gauze-covered jar for 4 hours and found that they too had lost extra weight. I don't know how he did that. 4 grams more than their non-electrified counterparts in the same amount of time. Denollet had the idea to place his subject on the floor underneath the electrified metal cage instead of in it, and they still lost as much, and even a bit more weight than when they were electrified themselves. Denollet had also observed acceleration in the growth of seedlings sprouting in the electrified pots. This too occurred when the pots were only placed on the floor beneath. Quote, finally, end quote, wrote Nollet, quote, I made a person sit for 5 hours on a table near the electrified metal case, end quote. The young woman lost 4.5 drams, D-R-A-M-S, more weight than when she had actually been electrified herself. Nollet was thus the first person back in 1753 to report significant biological effects from exposure to a DC, direct current, electrical field, the kind of field that, according to mainstream science today, has no effect whatsoever. In fact, very little is used in DC power. Remember that there was Westinghouse and Tesla together worked with Edison. There were 2 players in America that were dealing with electric power. One was a believer in direct current, and the other one was a believer in alternative current. The one that was involved with direct current was Edison. And the one that was successful was the one that went to Buffalo, New York, which was, I think it was Buffalo, New York, was Tesla and Westinghouse. Okay, so Tesla worked for Westinghouse at one time. In fact, Tesla gave quite a bit of money and time in that event that took place in Buffalo, New York, because they lighted up the whole area with this alternating current. Table 1 lists the effects of humans reported by most early electricians on electrical charge or small currents on DC electricity. Electrically sensitive people today will recognize most of it, if not all of them. Effects of electricity as reported in the 18th century. So this is what took place in the 18th century, and these are what we call 2 groups. One is non-therapeutic effects. The other is called therapeutic and neutral effects. So they would change in pulse rate, sensation of taste and light and sound, increase in body temperature, pain relief, restoration of muscle tone, stimulation of appetite, mental exhilaration, sedation, perspiration, salivation, secretion of earwax, secretion of mucus, menstruation, ureteric contraction, lactation and urination, and defecation. On the other hand, non-therapeutic effects were dizziness, nauseated, headaches, nervousness, irritability, mental confusion, depression, insomnia, drowsiness, fatigue, weakness, numbness and tingling, muscles and joint pains, muscle spasm and cramps, backache, heart palpitations, chest pain, colic, diarrhea, constipation, nosebleeds, hemorrhaging, itching, tremors, seizures, paralysis, fever, respiratory infections, shortness of breath, coughing, wheezing and asthma attack, eye pain, weakness and fatigue, ring in the ears, and metallic taste. And that is chapter 2. We're not going to do any more of this. I think it's close to probably probably about an hour long now. So I'm going to stop here at this point. So thank you for being here. Actually, an hour and 9. So we got someone named Mike. Actually, let's see. I've got a couple. H2O Savior was here. Good day. Mike Melcher. I guess this is at 3:22, which is roughly about 30 minutes ago. We certainly live in an electromagnetic universe. I pay attention to the sun's activity, which when it is injecting solar forces, it affects us. I can almost tell a flare happening based on how crazy others, I guess, act. I guess that's what you're saying. You got AR, I guess it's act. Others act. Anyway, thank you for that comment, Mike. So again, I'm reading from this particular book. Again, a friend suggested this to me, and so I thought, I've read this book over a year ago myself, and was basically shocked at what was going on. Never knew this. No one never told me this. Whatever, such and such. And this book is called Invisible Rainbow, and it's not, it's not a big time seller, folks. This is what most books are, that tell you some things. But there are people who are trying to get the truth out and saying, okay, what actually happened long ago? So it's called Invisible Rainbow, and reason why I share this information was simply I was listening to Dr. Bill online, not online, but on a recording deal, McGraw, McGraw, who is actually involved with a company called Spooky 2. Spooky 2 is simply a device that basically are two products, two main things. So Spooky 2 makes a product that basically works on what we call Tesla's inventions. And then the other one is based upon Raymond Rice's inventions. So Tesla invented what we call scalar energy. Scalar energy is simply, it's actually forever. And scalar was actually not even him discovering it. It was invented by, not invented, but it was actually discovered by a gentleman in Scotland, if I recall. And I don't remember his name right now. But I got some of this information from this gentleman who's now in Panama, who's actually helping people who have all kinds of issues in their lives to do with their health. And he's using these particular machines, so to speak. So Tesla built what we call a scalar energy. And what this is simply is there are two particular ways of working with this. You have what they call a transmitter and a receiver. And it works in a way simply is that it creates an aura in between those two machines. And we would call it simply as you would sit or lay in the aura to actually heal yourself. Okay. So that's Tesla's invention. Although Tesla understood this because simply he played with what we call remote control. He knew something of this nature even at that point, I should say. And he was scoffed at later on in his life. And basically, he had helped many people, but the problem was simply is he was ridiculed because the AMA is out to get people of this nature. They didn't want the truth out. Okay. So the other guy is Raymond Royal Rife, R-I-F-E, who developed what we call Rife, R-I-F-E, frequencies to actually kill pathogens within your body. So these are two different diametric ways of dealing with a problem. Raymond Rife is basically trying to kill what we call unwanted guests within you. Similar to what we call, for example, lack of a better example, like a leech that gets onto your body and begins to suck the blood out of you. Well, pathogens and all these type of things, they're what we call good bacteria and bad bacteria. So you don't want to destroy all the good bacteria. But we're talking about pathogens, what we call stealing your energy that takes place in your body. That goes on today, okay? And so with this, that's what Raymond Rife went with. We would call it a killing modality, okay? So it's about killing what's within you that's not supposed to be there. And he actually discovered this by something he built his own microscope. So he saw this happening while he used this particular machine to do this. So he knew that it would not harm the good things, but only the things that actually cause harm to the body. So that was the kill type of program. And then the other program is by Tesla, who is actually completely opposite, is actually about healing modality. Both are needed because simply in your body, simply is to do. You need to heal yourself because you need to heal your cells. Your cells today are weakened. So you want them to be working at omnial position, omnial presence, meaning they work at their peak. They work well, so to speak. And so what happens simply is that that's his process of Tesla in that. And again, like Raymond Wright, both are needed in trying to have good health today. Yes. So if anyone wants to know more, that is, about this guy, you can actually go into BitChute and look into Dr. Bill McGraw, I should say, McGraw. Okay, thank you for being here, I should say, and thank you, Mike, for your comments. Appreciate you being here. Thank you for your comments. Again, the name of the book is simply called Invisible Rainbow, Electricity and Life by author Firstenberg, Firstenberg. This book is not a well-known publishing. I doubt it's even sold 10,000 copies. Okay, but it's valuable to figure out what's going on, and we'll begin to get in what I'll call I see K-Bear. Good to see you, K-Bear. 33, good to see you. What's happening simply, electricity affects us, and we're not being told about it. Okay, and it's routed in your houses, such and such. But there's now a new problem that's been roughly in the last 10 to 15 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, that's sort of shown up on the radar. And that's what's beginning to cause havoc already with people in their lives. And they use antennas for those purposes. Okay. So we'd had certain diseases that there were no diseases, what we call cancer, and those things. When I spoke on this book here, the first 2 chapters, there was no things such as these beforehand. So what it means simply is what started it. Well, what started was to change the frequency of the earth. And that affects, we also know simply is that the quote unquote sun, with its magnetic charges, affects life on this planet. It does. So again, I'll be back with this particular reading more of this book. This is a great book. I just suggest you can get it at Amazon, very much so. You can read it yourself. And it's got notes on it. He's done the work, guys. So it's not something he just picked up and said, let's put this together. No, he's done his work. This book was written in 2017, and it was actually not rewritten, but actually published in 2020 here in the United States. So I would advise you to look into this. And thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. And take care. Thank you for your comments, K-Beer and Mike, and also a gentleman named HTO Savior. Have a good day. Take care.